Mr. Robinson, what is our topic today?
Topic today is going to be the discussion of the infamous Will Smith Oscars slap.
Let's talk about that. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. I'm here with Mr. John Robinson. Hello, Mr. Robinson.
Hello, Mr. Smith.
Today we're going to be talking about the Oscars. As Mr. Robinson mentioned, we're going to be talking about the Will Smith Oscar slap of Mr. Chris Rock. But before we do, it's worth pointing out the Oscars. On one hand, who cares? The ratings are declining for the program. Let it die. You know, the ratings are declining. We don't have to burn it with fire as much as would be tempting to do. We can just let it die. But on the other hand, the Oscars represent a time when our culture is on display in a way it's not in other circumstances. Its values are on display. What's important to our movers and shakers is on display. And in that sense, there often is something to learn in the aftermath afterwards. It doesn't recommend the Oscars. Just like we can learn something from a plane crash or a train accident, doesn't mean we encourage those things, but it does mean sometimes it's worth taking a look. And I think that's the case in this particular circumstance. Do you, Mr. Robinson?
Yes, in fact, you and I, as we were discussing how we wanted to handle the topic and doing a little bit of show prep, as they say in the business.
Show prep. We're such professionals.
At first it seems kind of when you boil it down, a relatively trivial thing. But as you and I unpacked and explored it, there's a lot going on here that could be discussed that goes right into our theme of viewing things through a biblical lens.
So, if you did not see it, actually, I'll put Mr. Robinson on the spot and see if he'll confess. Did you actually see the Oscars live? Did you watch it
No.
On the edge of your seat? You didn't?
I've watched it in the past, and I mean like 30 years ago. And I wasn't even aware that they were coming on. And I think it was the next morning I come on, and all of a sudden there's all, they have like some of the news sites have the little animated GIFs that just kind of loop.
Yes.
And there's something about Will Smith and smacking Chris Rock, and I'm like, this feels like fake news. Honestly,
Right.
That's my first reaction to it. But no, I did not watch it, and
Okay.
I just saw it in the news the next morning.
Okay, I'm in a similar boat. I will say, though, we were actually on Hollywood Boulevard, my wife and I. We were in California for a TWP, which went fantastically, by the way. And we had gotten there. We had some time before we made it to our hotel, and we said, hey, let's go look at the Walk of Fame, the Star Walk, those kind of things, the Chinese theater where Star Wars premiered. So we did go do those things. And the street was blocked off. We could walk the sidewalks, but the street was blocked off. And we asked someone why. It's because they were preparing for the Oscars. They were putting all the structures in place. And we actually went into the theater where the now infamous slap would take place. We didn't go into the theater proper, but we were outside of the theater and looking at the various things. So in that sense, it was fascinating. And for the record, Hollywood Boulevard, simultaneously fascinating and disgusting. It was not a clean place.
I'm pretty sure I was there. We went on a trip when I was like 18, maybe. And I do remember seeing some of the walk of the stars thing, and being struck by, because you never see that when they show pictures or they cover so and so got his star on the Walk of Fame, which apparently it's not too difficult. It just needs some money. But it was trashy around there, and there was a lot of I don't say a lot. I mean, this was like 30 years ago, so who knows. But that it was much trashier and full of transients or even homeless, perhaps. I was surprised by it.
Yeah, it was not the glamour you see on the Oscars, that's for sure.
I think the first thing we tackle, we don't have to take very long on this, is, was it real or not? Was this staged?
It is. You know what? Actually, maybe we should mention what actually did happen, just in case. Like you mentioned, people might listen to this sometime later. If you didn't happen to watch the Oscars, like Mr. Robinson and I did not, and have been under a rock, not Chris Rock, under a rock, and didn't see the news, then what you have is Chris Rock, the comedian, was going to present an award. He's making comments as comedians do. He refers to Jada Pinkett Smith, and he points to her and says, Jada, I love you. G.I. Jane 2, can't wait to see you. He was clearly referring to her shaved head, G.I. Jane 2, they're all in the Army and the rest. Well, she clearly was bothered. Her husband was laughing, but she was bothered, and she does have alopecia, which causes involuntary hair loss, which causes a medical condition. And next thing you know, Will Smith, after having laughed at the joke initially, is walking up onto the stage We can talk about whether Chris Rock knew what was coming. We'll talk about that. But regardless, just slaps him square, across the face and walks off. And Chris Rock starts commenting, "Hey, it was a G.I. Jane 2 joke." And Will Smith starts mentioning some profanities. I won't give the detail. But regardless, he doesn't want him mentioning his wife's name. Says that twice, and Chris Rock moves on. And gives the presentation. Clearly shaken, but moves on. Even afterwards, actually, some of the footage coming out shows that it was shaken for some time. So that said, if you didn't see it, that's what happened. There's clips all over the internet. It'd be hard to miss at this point. So now, Mr. Robinson, controversy number one, which we will get out of the way probably pretty quickly. What do you think? What's the question?
Well, like I said earlier, when I first saw it, it was everywhere. It was showing up everywhere. It didn't feel real. Mm-hmm. And then when and most of the time, I actually will move on because I really am like, whatever, the Hollywood people aren't getting along. But it was not going away, and a lot of people were talking about it. And so, but when I went and actually made myself go watch it, my first reaction was, something doesn't seem right. I wonder if this was staged. Now, I am not deeply invested in that in any way. Like, if it turns out I would probably characterize Will Smith as, especially if you thought it was humorous at first, and then you realize, oh wait, I better do something to defend my wife's honor. More on that later. And goes, but his reaction was just so. I think that's what it is. His reaction was so surprising. You could see him being upset about it. That makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe even yell something at him. Hey, don't make jokes about my wife, whatever. But to actually get out of his chair and go on stage, by the way, in front of millions of people, and assault Chris Rock, it just seemed like. It felt a little staged to me.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that. I do not feel it was staged for a variety of reasons. I think it has a lot of hallmarks of authenticity. If it were staged, I feel rather than him laughing at the joke at first, they would have planned it where he was immediately upset. Like, how dare you? Sense. As opposed to seeing his wife's reaction or whatever it is that suddenly changed his mind since he thought it was funny at first. And I haven't done professional acting, clearly, but I've been on stage where we've simulated fights and slaps. There's some friends of mine and I, because we knew how to do stage fake slaps. We used to enjoy like being in a park or something and doing that and having people wonder what in the world, and then we'd explain what we were doing. And we know you can drag a person by the hair, but not really, but make it's all sorts of things you can do. And clearly there was contact. It was actually a slap. But just looking at the faces afterwards, and Chris Rock's in particular, because I don't know that he's done some acting clearly, but he did come across to me as someone who was clearly stunned. Now, of course, that could still be staged. So, hey, something's going to happen. Will Smith's going to come up, but just go along with it or something. Yep. And so maybe he was thinking, maybe he's going to come up and he's going to insult me and we're going to laugh together. But no, I get slapped in the face. But still, so kind of like you, I lean the other direction rather, not like you. I don't think it was staged. But that said, like you, if word came out that it was, it's not like I'm going to be stunned. I gave a split some time ago, living in fake world, I think it was, because my wife and I call about this being fake world that we live in, and so many things around us are absolutely and utterly false that you just don't know anymore. So.
Well, that's a great example of as you and I have talked about this, how you can unpack something that seems relatively straightforward. Somebody getting upset and hitting somebody else over something being said offensive, how much you can unpack. There's a whole topic here on Hollywood fake world. I mean, like from every angle. Like, first of all, Hollywood is designed to make made up movies and stories, and we want to be entertained. And I'm not even digging for that, but they really, over time, Hollywood is really its whole own parallel universe where they live in a world that the rest of us do not, and it becomes an echo chamber in many ways. And anyway, so that's an area we could go.
We could, and actually that would be a great topic for the future. However, what we're getting into, and this is what I think you and I both, as we were talking about it, what caused us to agree that this is a worthwhile topic to discuss on the podcast, because regardless of whether it was staged or whether it was sincere and actually did happen as everybody watched it, regardless of that, there's a lot to take away from it. There's actually a lot to learn about it. In particular, I'd like to kick us off by referring to a poll. YouGov, is it YouGov.org? I actually don't recall, but YouGov. It's YouGov.com, I think. It's a very popular site for polling and trying to produce quick results. And they did a poll of some 2,000 plus adults in the United States and said the following. On stage at the Academy Awards, comedian, I'm a professional speaker, comedian Chris Rock made a joke at the public expense of Jada Pinkett Smith. Her husband, Will Smith, responded by walking on stage and hitting Chris Rock. Do you think Smith's actions were or were not acceptable? That was the question. So they polled, and first you look at the broad results in the poll. The broad results were, and maybe I can try to find a link to this. I could possibly add that to the website, but I'm referring to the poll results as of a couple of days ago. Perhaps they've changed. So 22% said the action that Will Smith's actions were acceptable. So less than a quarter. 61% said they were not acceptable, so not quite 2/3, but close, and then 18% just weren't sure. So that's broad disapproval in general. Well, what's interesting is they break those votes down into various categories. They do it racially, they do it politically, they do it regionally in terms of the country, and it really is interesting that most breakdowns are fairly consistent. You look at the racial breakdown, and while it varies in terms of disapproval, it varies from, say, 52% to 61%. All of them are more than half. More than half of the people thought that it was inappropriate. While it varies from 22% to 27% that it was acceptable, it still hovers around that quarter, that quarter of people. And that's the racial breakdown. I didn't specify what that was. The political breakdown was all consistent, incredibly consistent. The regional part of the country, again, consistent. But here's where it gets really, really different. Where the statistics look different in the breakdown are age breakdowns. So if you look at the question, the statement that Chris Rock's action was not acceptable, the aggregate was 61% said it was not acceptable. Well, in the 65 and over age bracket, 77%, so more than 3/4 of people of that age bracket thought that it was unacceptable. But then you drop in age to the 45-64 category. That's you and me, Mr. Robinson. I know you're highly aware of our age like I am. Then it drops to 72% said it was unacceptable.
So that's still relatively high.
It's still relatively high. And then you go to the 30 to 44 age bracket, it continues to drop. Now only 53% say that Will Smith's actions were unacceptable. Then you get to the 18 to 29 bracket, and 40%, less than half, think that it was unacceptable. That to me is astonishing. A drop from our elders at 77% down to the 18 to 29 bracket, 40%. And then, of course, for the Living Youth website, we have teenagers coming. Ostensibly, looking at the trend, you would have gotten less than 40. You would have gotten maybe a third of teenagers would have thought that it was unacceptable, which I think is actually really, really telling.
I know that you can take statistics and start to craft any kind of narrative you want, but it is by far it's fascinating that the biggest difference was age related. And you and I don't know what you would consider your most formulative years, but I always think of the 80s when I was middle school and into high school, and Reagan's president, and the country was still relatively conservative, and there was still a relatively strong ethic within the country of what was acceptable and what wasn't. And so the question I start to ask is this a sign of the end time, that the younger kids who've grown up in a very different America, I would argue, over the last 20, 30 years, big shifts starting in the mid to late 90s. If it's, older generations always accuse the next generation of being soft and weak and destroying the country. But it really did make me feel a little bit about Matthew 24, where Christ says, because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold.
Right.
And, the hippies came along in the 60s and 70s, and they were peace and love, but really what they wanted was to not have rules governing behavior. And so it makes me wonder, as things have progressed and the country's been less and less bound by the laws that have restricted behavior in terms of biblical morals, whether that was consciously from the Bible or not, that we followed general principles of the Bible, and now that's gone away. You know, the work used to be trying to convince Protestants. You know, Dr. Meredith was always on this, that the Catholics had really taken everything off, and you know, and the Reformation was great, but come around now nobody cares anymore about Protestant or Catholic. And the discussion amongst younger people is like they don't even know if they believe in the Bible anymore. And so now you've had this kind of progression to where, you know, you've had Antifa running around for a few years claiming to be anti-fascist, but also saying, you know what, it's actually okay to hit a Nazi. So, you know, we went from peace and love hippies, abandoned the law and our structures, and now, you know, 40 years later, we end up with a younger group that thinks it's okay to do physical violence to a Nazi, which, as you pointed out, a Nazi could be defined as anyone or anything that doesn't agree with your progressive worldview.
They have really reduced the definition of Nazi while behaving in Nazi-like fashion. You read your history of World War II and the rest, and you know, you look at the brown shirts and how they behaved in Germany, and they're using exactly the same tactics. I remember seeing footage, whether the people were Antifa or just Antifa fanboys, hard to say, but during, of course, there were some peaceful protests in 2020, but of course there were also definitely violent riots in 2020. I remember seeing footage of people beating a man to death in Dallas with skateboards in 2020. So you cannot tell me there were not violent riots. And I remember seeing this old couple, clearly old. The woman had a walker. Not say you don't have to be old to have a walker. Who knows? Maybe I'll have one next week. But still, an elderly couple, and this guy in gear. He's got, you know, they turn these bicycle helmets into like, you know, kind of warrior helmets, if you will. But he's got goggles on. He's got the right, and he's standing in front of her and not letting her pass. And she's just trying to cross the street, and he's yelling at her, and they're screaming at these people. It reminds me also of during the protest. I remember seeing a young black woman speaking to a much older black man. She was with a group wanting to tear down Lincoln's statue in Washington, D.C., and he was actually part of a group that led tourists around Washington, D.C. to show them sites that were relevant to black culture, you know, in terms of slavery and the rest. And he'd been committed to this cause of educating people about slavery for a vast part of his life. And here's this young woman, he's trying to stop them from tearing down the statue. And it's not, I can understand people disagreeing, but the young woman wasn't disagreeing. She was screaming in his face, calling him things that no young woman would have the right to call an older man when she's standing atop his shoulders in some kind of way. Right. And he, credit to him, because it is not easy to do. In fact, I would say if it's real, Will Smith did not demonstrate this. He kept such composure, recognized he's talking to a younger, weaker, frankly dumber person, and kept trying to explain to her what he felt she wasn't understanding, and she is just screaming in his face. It is interesting that because I had a verse that I was prompted in thinking of this shift from older to younger about in Proverbs 22, where God talks about not moving the ancient landmark which your fathers have set. There are understandings of proper decorum, of what's appropriate and not appropriate in various situations that older generations have established, that as younger generations come along, and I would include you and me, we definitely have elders, and in terms of age-wise elders, and it's easy to cast those things aside when the Bible warns us against doing that so quickly. But man, when you mentioned that verse in Matthew about the love of many growing cold because of lawlessness, that just seemed like such a perfect fit in this circumstance. In particular, the details are fuzzy, but for instance, in the case of the Smiths, Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith, they've been kind of open in public about the, let's say, their struggle in their marriage with actually running it in any kind of way God would expect a marriage to run, to the point that we were looking at it earlier. It was Jada Pinkett Smith saying, no, it's hard to say. One of them was saying that, we don't call it a marriage, we call each other life partners or something. Yeah. It shows an absolute lack of understanding of what marriage even is. They've talked about relationships outside of their marriage and how Miss Smith, Jada Pinkett Smith, saying, "Oh, I don't need my husband's permission. I give myself permission." In terms of having this extramarital relationship, it's like, well, in a situation like that, God's law is not truly at all present. You're at the mercy of these passions and this confusion. To a certain extent, actions like this aren't surprising coming from a base like that.
Well, at one point they got married in what we would consider a traditional sense and considered themselves husband and wife. You read through a little bit of the history of them, but over time it started to become like a loose association between the two of them. They don't like the word open marriage, but the way they characterize it, I find myself
mature. That I just know,
a mature relationship.
It's a mature marriage, right?
And so you have the situation where they've kind of abandoned the guiding principles that a marriage would be, and that is a contract between two people, and it's a husband and a wife. And so you have the situation where his wife cheated on him. That's how most people portray it. Then he feels, well, I guess we have a mature relationship, so that's okay. What is it that she said? That she doesn't have to have her husband's permission?
Yeah, something like, I think people were probably probing the relationship, like, was it really open where you each have permission to have these relationships? And her comment was something to the effect of, I don't need my husband's permission, to have a relationship. So it's my call.
Instead of him taking a stance that that's not okay, because that's not okay, he was open and tolerant about it. Like, what do we hear about open and tolerant, right? It's just everything is getting slowly. We're destroying the meanings and the boundaries, like you said, the ancient landmarks, and then he's a proud man, like most of us are in a sense, and he feels emasculated. I would think he would feel emasculated. And so you have this situation where it's all descended into lawlessness to where he actually gets up and slaps another man over this, perceived insult, which,
right.
I mean, when you go to the Oscars, you know what you're getting yourself into. There's going to be jokes. There's going to be a little. I mean, he's lucky he didn't get Ricky Gervais as the.
Yeah, Ricky Gervais would have been far more brutal. I think it's actually reasonable. We'll find out. I think Chris Rock has been wise in not saying much, because when people are busy taking your side, there's no need to jump in and necessarily ruin that. But someone has said that he expressed off stage that he didn't even know she necessarily had a disease. And so many of these people do that. Individuals do crazy things in terms of famous people. You shave your head because you like the style, or you're trying to get attention. Lady Gaga wore a dress made of meat, right? And to a certain extent, you can make a comment like that, like, hey, I'm loving it. Hey, see you in G.I. Jane 2. And actually, it could be an innocuous sort of statement. You mentioned in terms of feeling emasculated. Yeah, the thing is, there are manly ways to handle things. There are masculine ways to handle even something like that, where you truly believe someone, like in a public setting, in a setting, of decorum, which I think that's worth talking about maybe another time, because we don't have so much time today. But it's such a weird setting anyway, to expect a certain amount of decorum, and yet it's come to understand that there's going to be weirdness, there's going to be extravagance, there's going to be weird statements. So at what point, really, it's a world in which the boundaries of decorum are kind of fuzzy. But that said, there are masculine ways to handle things. In Proverbs chapter 25 and verse 28, we're told, whoever has no rule over his own spirit is like a city broken down without walls. You become defenseless. If you don't rule your own spirit, you become defenseless in that way. And so you're acting on impulse. You're acting on things that normally you should be able to guard against and treat better. I do think this relates to what Mr. Will Smith did, because when he gave his speech, and it should be mentioned, later on Instagram or some social media, he did apologize to Chris Rock.
But not immediately.
Not immediately. When he actually got up and accepted his award minutes later, he clearly, I do think, was sincerely shaken. That's debatable, but I do think he was sincerely shaken. But regardless, he apologized to the Academy. He apologized to people attending. He did not apologize to Chris Rock at the time. However, one of the things he said in that, I think, directly speaks to Proverbs 25:28. He said, really only making it a quasi-apology, because when you do apologize, you don't justify the actions you did, you're apologizing for. He said, love will make you do crazy things. Now, I wrote about that on the livingyouth.org webpage, just a brief write-up about that. But the thing is, no, God's love actually doesn't make you lose control, where you're not actually judging the right and wrong of what you do. You're just reacting on impulse. There's just no permission for that. Yes, our passions can impact us in powerful ways, but that said, no, we don't have any excuse to not have rule over our own spirits. And some have noticed that he probably was out of control a bit. Like he himself says, love makes you do crazy things. I'm sorry, you don't get to excuse yourself.
Right.
That's what crimes of passion are called. Man, when I came in and I saw that guy like that, I didn't mean to stab him. Next thing I know, I was stabbing him. Right. Yeah, there's a phrase for that. It's a crime of passion.
Suddenly I was stabbing
him.
Yeah,
suddenly I was stabbing him. I saw that. Anyways, suddenly I was stabbing him. That sounds terrible. But regardless, yeah, nowhere do we really get that opportunity to say, man, I can't believe I did this terrible thing, but love will make you do crazy things.
Right.
No, that's what the world likes to suggest, that, oh yes, these passions cause us to throw all caution to the wind and absolutely abandon ourselves to these moments. No, that's what the devil would prefer that we do.
Well, it's just Mr. Armstrong had such a concise definition of godly love, which was outflowing concern for other people. So if he had true love, then it wouldn't make him do crazy things and assault somebody. And also why I think it's so important that, and a distinctive of the church teaching, so many Protestants feel like the law was a burden and had to be done away with, instead of viewing it as that's what fosters love by putting boundaries around our moral behavior and our relationships. I mean, we the Bible rightly, it's so ironic, but it's divided in how to love God and how to love your neighbor. And
Ten Commandments, right,
and it's putting limits on the kind of behavior we saw. So then my question for you would be, since we're trying to look at this from a Christian perspective, let's put ourselves in Will Smith's situation. It doesn't have to be at the Oscars. Let's say we were somewhere out public, and somebody who had enough attention of enough other people that they said something somewhat derogatory towards our wife or made a joke at our wife's expense. Well, what would you do? What should Will Smith have done in that Oscar situation?
I think he had a variety of... Now, of course, he presumably didn't know he was going to win the Oscar. I guess it's possible. Some people would say all those things are rigged. I think I don't think that's the case. But regardless, the fact is, not only did he have an opportunity, because he did win the Oscar, and actually would have been coming from a high hand in that particular place to take a high road, but also they talked to the press afterwards. There would have been ample opportunity to allow someone who you believe has made a crass joke to take the high road and shame them all the more, right? To show that you're actually higher class of individual in terms of what a man can do. You also could have just stood up and walked out. I think one of the most powerful statements that could have been made is you take your wife by the hand, you walk out, leave the Oscars, even knowing you're up for an award, knowing you're up for what's considered one of the highest awards they give, the Best Actor award, and to show that, yeah, if they're not going to respect your wife's integrity and you're not going to respect her as a person, then why would you want to be a part of that? I think that would be a statement we would still be talking about today, but not from the perspective of the mistake that he made, but respect to, man, that's a guy who was willing, because when is he going to win another Best Actor award? That would have been sacrificing something actually on behalf. I think there's multiple things he could have done without acting like a child.
For some reason, one of the phrases the Bible often, like it's a theme throughout the Bible, in my opinion. It's a lesser theme, but it's in there just enough, and that is, especially in a world where we started having microaggressions, don't be easily offended.
Yes.
And was it insensitive? Well, he might have even just done it in ignorance. But let's say he knew, and he there's so many more derogatory things that could have been said that you would have much better understood why Will Smith felt the need to aggressively address it then. Mm-hmm. But if we follow the principle of don't be easily offended, you let it go. And then I like to hope I would do this, and then when there is an appropriate time, because that was not the appropriate time to address it, pull Chris Rock aside later.
Right.
Say, hey, Chris, I know you're out here doing your job, but sometimes stuff gets a little too personal, and my wife's really been struggling with this medical condition, and she owns it pretty well, but she
You could even give him the benefit of the doubt and ask him,
Yeah.
are you aware? When you said that, were you aware?
Right. That's even better. And then you handled it with class, and he actually feels bad. Not that
Right.
that shouldn't be your goal, right?
Yep.
But that he would,
Right. And then he finds an opportunity to apologize.
Right. Right.
You could even have talked to him off, because they can't communicate. You talk to him off stage during a commercial break.
Right.
And if he had any other opportunity that evening, he would have spent the rest of the night apologizing for that, or something.
Well, and to your point earlier, Chris Rock has come out of this so far with a lot of people supporting him, and he's handled it classier than Will Smith did.
Yeah, at least so far.
My wife sent a scripture when I asked her about the topic, and she sent me one that I thought was pretty good. It's actually not a scripture where you think it would be. Lamentations 3:30.
Oh, wow.
And this is a New English translation. Okay, so if you have the New King James Version, it'll be a little bit different. Let him offer his cheek to the one who hits him. Let him have his fill of insults.
Wow.
So if Chris Rock continues on this path, he's taken the high road, and he's actually, unlikely he realizes it, but he has fulfilled teaching in the Bible, and it's actually gone well for him, whereas Will Smith kind of looks like a bully, honestly.
Actually, you mentioned that verse. It caused me to think that we're sort of risk missing the forest for the trees. Even Jesus Christ said, turn the other cheek,
Yep.
Let someone who slaps you on one side give him the other. And it's not because we just want to be carpets.
Right.
We want people to walk on us. But there is a remarkable nobility in that. I've had to think about it. Thankfully, I've not been physically assaulted yet in the work. I do receive hate mail.
Yet.
That's one of the joys of being, public in some kind of way on the telecast and in sermons is you get to enjoy the blessings of hate mail here and there. And there have been some doozies. Sometimes Mr. Wester and I joke about them, and ones we get we would like to frame or something. But I've actually had people I visited, not in the church, but out in the world, outside of the church, and you think, well, boy, this is kind of going to be able to figure out where I live, and afterwards you're kind of wondering about that. And I thought, in some situations like that, where maybe someone is publicly bringing me down, trying to humiliate me, whatever, or assaulting me, I hope I would actually have the ability to just turn the other cheek. I've heard several say that professionals say they thought the way Chris Rock handled it was about as professional as you might expect.
Right.
What is
right.
you were the one that think first introduced me to it. Mike Tyson, the boxer. One of his comments says that everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Yeah, that's right.
Everybody has a plan until he gets punched in the face. And to actually maintain your composure on stage and continue forward and try to, because there were some original comments. I think he actually dropped one bad word at the time, but for them, that's frankly pretty normal in their culture. That is Hollywood culture. But just to move on and try and do your job is actually pretty is really pretty impressive. And I would say illustrates someone who is not like a city whose walls are broken down, but is someone who apparently maintains some sense of self-control.
But to come full circle and maybe wrap up our podcast.
That'd be great.
Our initial reaction is probably still the right one. Who cares? Their viewership is circling the drain. Russell Brand, who's another comedian, so many people have weighed in on this.
Yes.
He referred to the Oscars, and he realizes there's some level of hypocrisy there because he's been to the Oscars, okay? Mm-hmm. But he called it a festival of meaninglessness. And I thought that was such a good way of putting it. It really is literally a group of people getting together to congratulate themselves and give each other awards.
That's right. Right.
And
a group of people who see the world through their limousine window.
That's exactly
these are
right.
not people who see the world like you and I do.
So anyway, Hollywood's kind of got their own alternate reality going on out there, and to some degree, I think who cares is probably the right response. But we couldn't ignore it it felt like a natural opportunity to show, especially with the age group breakdown, how far our country slid towards now what seems like a reasonable reaction to an offense.
Right, and hopefully to encourage our young people not to give up on the sense of decorum and the standards of the past, and not to give up on the idea that we do have a responsibility to regulate ourselves and not to allow ourselves those moments where we just justify the things that we would do for reasons that God Himself would not justify our actions. So, I can't believe we spent all this time talking about the Oscars. That'll probably
It won't happen every year.
Smith and Robinson.